Egypt, as to update to our viewers, clashes between Egyptian military forces and Coptic Christian protesters have left at least 19 people killed. The Christian demonstrators were rallying against the ruling junta, demanding the rebuilding of a church which was torched last week. They came under fire while marching on the state television building. Now we're going to be joined through live satellite by one of our guests, Mark Glenn, who's with Crescent Cross and Solidarity Movement. Mr. Glenn, what can you tell us about the clashes that are occurring in Egypt?
Well, the first thing that we have to ask is whether or not this is what it appears to be on the surface, or whether there are interested parties who are deliberately fomenting this clash. And, of course, not wanting to sound like a broken record, nevertheless, this old strategy of divide and conquer is something that Israel and her intelligence agents are constantly doing. Let's not forget about the fact that that there have been several spy scandals that have erupted in Egypt within the last year involving Israeli spies who have been caught and arrested. And this is exactly the kind of thing, the destabilization of Egypt and the breaking it up into different sectarian regions is something that benefits only one entity in the region, and that is Israel. So, again, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, in my opinion, what we see taking place right now has all of the fingerprints of some intelligence agency behind it. The first question we have to ask is who burned down the church recently, and with regards to the present clashes that are taking place, who started throwing Molotov cocktails at the security forces that resulted in them firing live rounds on these demonstrators. So again, we have to ask these questions. We're not at the luxury anymore of just taking events like this at face value. We have to ask these questions whether or not there are interested parties who are deliberately fomenting these things in order to create an atmosphere of instability in Egypt.
Well, when you say creating the foment for this atmosphere, with who against who would you say that this is occurring against in Egypt?
Well, it has been Israeli policy now for going on 30 years that eventually Egypt and the other Arab countries would need to be broken up into smaller factions, and that there was a policy paper that had been written on an official level entitled Israel's Strategy in the Middle East for the 1980s by Oded Yanon. And one of the specific things that he talked about in this policy paper that was adopted by the Israeli government was breaking Egypt up along sectarian lines between Christians and Muslims, and in order to make it easier to manage, instead of one big large Arab country such as Egypt, and everyone knows that Egypt is the powerhouse Arab country in the region, instead of one large Arab country, they would like to see it broken up into 4 or 5 smaller countries. And this has been specifically discussed, creating a separate area of Egypt known as Coptic Egypt. So these events taking place right now would fit exactly in with what Israel and other Western countries, Western intelligence agencies, would like to see happen in the region, which is to break these countries up into smaller, easier to manage entities.
Very well. Mr. Glenn, let me just keep you with us as we're going to be now joined by our correspondent, May Kamal. May, this is kind of odd that the latest violence comes just weeks before the parliamentary election coming up November 28th, wouldn't you say?
There's a lot of speculation going on around here among regular Egyptians and even activists who are starting to comment about the events of today. Of course, again, there's a lot of speculation and rumors at this point, but people are seeing a trend with the actions of the military, and they do fear that the military is trying to enforce the emergency law and to justify its reactivation after the revolution, and as well to enforce, of course, today the military council has said that it would stop using military trials against civilians except in specific cases, and this might be a clear example of some of these specific cases that they plan on using military trials in. But of course there's a lot of fears that this is building towards either postponing the parliamentary elections in late November or creating tension and violence around these parliamentary elections for presenting their reason for either ex-MPs that were part of the former regime to contest against the parliamentary election results.
Well, May, Mark Glenn, our guest on the show with us from Crescent and Cross Solidarity Movement, says Molotov cocktails were thrown by the protesters against the security forces. Do we know which protesters threw the Molotov cocktails at the security forces?
Personally, when I was there as the violence was happening, I did not see any violence being exerted from the protesters against either the military or the police forces who were present there. But I also did see a large number of families. I saw families containing the mother, the father, and the children taking part in these protests and march, and who were completely horrified when the violence started breaking up. So it's also very hard to imagine that these protesters left their homes with their families intending to incite violence or to start violence against an establishment such as the military. But however, the march, since it started moving from the Cairo district of Shubra, which is quite a distance until it reaches the state TV building known as Maspiru, it was being attacked by unknown men that we've grown accustomed here in Egypt to refer to them as thugs. Just because we can't identify them. But from the very start, this march was being targeted, and these protesters, no one said that they started any clashes while they were in Shubra or on their way to Maspiru, but they were being attacked constantly from the very start.
Very well. May, let me get back to our guest, Mr. Glenn. Mr. Glenn, the same question to you. Isn't it odd that these protests are occurring right before the parliamentary elections coming up on November 28th?
Of course, as we said earlier, all of these things have the fingerprints of intelligence, Western intelligence services all over them. When things like this happen, particularly this close to parliamentary elections, we have to at least suspect that there are interested parties who want to make sure that this ship of state is steered in a direction that is going to benefit Western and Israeli foreign policy objectives. And so who benefits from something like this at this time? A mere few weeks before these elections, of course, again, to create this air of instability and to basically get this new Egyptian government off with broken legs, so that it cannot even function as a viable political entity. Why not bring something like this into the picture? And keep in mind, something like this is very easy to orchestrate. All it takes is, as I said before, a gallon of gasoline and a few matches to burn a church down, to anger the Christian community at a time when Christian-Muslim relations are already strained in Egypt, and then to have a protest where you have a few well-placed individuals who have been trained at causing mayhem and escalating violence, to start throwing Molotov cocktails or rocks or whatever it may be. And of course the security forces, who are already on edge. They have had a year's worth of political and social upheaval. They're already on edge, so it's very easy to have something like this take place. It doesn't take a lot of planning or anything like that to bring something like this about. And again, all of this is only going to benefit one interest in the region, and of course that is Israel.
Very well, Mr. Glenn. Let me get back to May. May, so far we're getting reports more than 4 vehicles were set ablaze, and protesters breaking windows of parked cars, while the Army personnel were driving full speed at their cars towards the protesters. Why so much violence?
Again, we don't have an answer at this point at what exactly started the violence, but from eyewitness accounts and some of the explanations that we've heard, that these thugs that accompanied the march and were attacking the Copts as they marched towards Maspiru were the ones who actually incited or started the violence once in front of the state TV building, and that's when their reactions between both sides erupted. Again, what most people here in Egypt, or regular protesters, or people even who are watching at home, seeing images of armed vehicles driving at insane speeds into protesters rather than around them, trying to avoid them, are images that are very reminiscent of January 28 when clashes reached a peak and the police was actually forced to retreat for a number of weeks from Egyptian streets all over the country. We don't know exactly what started the violence, but what seems clear is that the army and security forces used an excessive amount of violence to try to get the situation back on control. We've seen two armed vehicles from the military burning in front of the TV building, and it's unclear who as well, because as we mentioned a number of times, there are secret elements or unknown elements labeled as thugs, who we believe, or people in general believe, attempted to break into civilian cars and actually burnt a number of these cars on the street.
Very well, May. Mr. Glenn, let me get back to you. The main focal point of the violence that occurred because of the protesters wanting the downfall of Field Marshal Hossein Tantawi, the leader of SCAF. Where do you think that will come in play?
Well, we're assuming, of course, that this is a genuine desire on the part of these Egyptian partisans. I'm not saying that it's not. We just have to remember that in a situation like this, information is managed. And, the real question that people, and particularly people in the West, should be asking themselves is this: why at this time? Now, the ratio in Egypt is you have 80 million people living in that country, 10% of which, roughly 10% of which, are Christian. We're talking about as many as 8 million Christians living in a mostly Muslim country. So why now? Why at this particular period in history, literally within just a few months, do we see all of this upheaval taking place? Of course, the narrative that we receive in the West is that Christians and Muslims cannot get along, and therefore they might as well just pick up their guns and their knives and go at each other, and may the best man win. Of course, in the end, there is only one entity who profits from this, and it is Israel and her Zionist lobby throughout the world. That's the real question that has to be asked: is why now? Why at this particular period in history, when Islam has been around for 1,400 years, do we see the Christians and Muslims fighting? This is an artificial conflict that is taking place. It has been started and is being managed by a third party who is going to benefit from centuries of warring between the two singularly largest civilizations in the world. We're talking about half the world's population being encompassed within the Christian and Islamic worlds. There's only one party who is going to benefit by these two civilizations wiping each other out, and it is the Zionist entity. So this is the real question that has to be asked. This is the real filter through which all of this information has to be considered as we see these things taking place. It is an artificial conflict. The Christians and the Muslims are perfectly capable of living peacefully side by side with each other. They have for centuries. It is only because this is an arson, a cultural arson of sorts. Somebody has shown up with a gallon of gasoline and some matches and has set this thing on fire in order to collect the insurance money that's going to follow after it's all over with. And it's the Jewish lobby worldwide. Let's just call it for what it is. Christians and Muslims need to put down their guns and understand that they have everything in common with each other, not the least of which are two vibrant civilizations, as I said, that make up half the world's population, and that they have a common enemy that would love nothing more than to see them wipe each other out so that what's left of the carcass, the vultures can come in and pick clean.
Very well. That was Mark Glenn with Crescent and Cross Solidarity Movement. And again, to our viewers who are joining us right now on Press TV, this is in regard to the clashes between Egyptian military forces and the Coptic Christian protesters, which have left at least 19 people killed. Around 150 have been wounded. The Christian demonstrators were rallying against the ruling junta, demanding the rebuilding of a church that was torched last week. They came under fire while